is, from your perspective, Jeff Sessions, going to be the next in line when it comes to political casualty after Michael Flynn regarding the Russian issue?
It is impossible to say at this point, because ultimately this is a political fight, a political decision. What's going on in Washington right now is somewhat reminiscent of the days of the Cold War, when a Republican president would be accused by the Democrats of being soft on the Russians, and a sitting Democratic president would be accused by the Republicans of being soft on the Russians, and we're seeing sort of a revitalization of that kind of language. But as for the Sessions issue, the key here is really not about the Russian connection per se, which was perfectly understandable, not illegal, and not even improper, as your report correctly mentioned. But whether he was honest in answering the question. And the question was phrased during the hearings in a way that made it sound like he was asked if he were making contact with the Russians as a representative of the Trump campaign. And it's his response, no, that is really causing the firestorm. So the whole relationship between Washington and Moscow has been caught up in domestic politics and the struggle over the Trump presidency disagreements. We'll see how it turns out. It's impossible to predict
We will
right
see
now.
that. Mr. Babich, briefly from you, what do you feel, I mean, coming from Moscow, being caught in this crossfire between the two political parties in Washington, whether Russia was and has been and will be trying to influence the election in the United States? To what extent do you think?
Well, I think Russia has not influenced the US election at all. I mean, if you ask me about the extent, I think it was zero. At least it was certainly smaller than the extent to which the United States has a habit of influencing the electoral campaigns in Russia. Let me remind you that when George Bush the Jr. came to Moscow, when Mr. Obama came to Moscow, they met the representatives of the Russian opposition, all of whom participated in elections. And there was no question about it in the Russian prosecutor's office, in the Russian parliament. No one asked these people, what did you talk about to Mr. Obama? Tell us the truth, tell us the truth under the oath. So I agree with Mr. Fedyashin that what's going on reminds us of the days of the Cold War, but I would say that it reminds me of the days of the Cold War in the Soviet Union. There is only one precedent that I can remember when someone in the Soviet Union would be punished for talking to the US ambassador, and that was Vyacheslav Molotov's wife. In the worst times of Joseph Stalin's rule. She talked to the Israeli ambassador and she was put in jail for that.
Well,
now, unfortunately, we see in the United States something that is vaguely reminiscent of the worst days of the Soviet Union, of Stalin's rule.
Well, certainly the backgrounds tend to be a little bit different if you could compare the political situation between the two countries then and now. But that is certainly a very interesting comparison.
The parallels are very obvious.
Very interesting comparison there, I have to say, Mr. Babich. The US media, on the other hand, are now comparing Trump's Russia problem to the Watergate scandal, which of course was something that happened during the Cold War. Let's take a look at this.
Watergate was a major political scandal in the United States in the 1970s, following a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. President Richard Nixon's administration tried to cover up its involvement in the break-in. When the conspiracy was discovered and investigated by the U.S. Congress, the Nixon administration's resistance to the investigation led to a constitutional crisis and ultimately Nixon's resignation.
Well, we all remember the history. That is a big part of the American contemporary history. Mr. Cui from China. Of course, many things going on in Washington may not be that familiar to us, and yet your perspective here, what's going on here, and how do you, as a Chinese scholar, see the drama going on now?
So firstly, I think that, or believe it's domestic affairs. internal affairs for the United States.
All right, that's fair.
So we should not to interfere.
We're
about
not going to say you influenced the election at all. So go ahead and talk about your own personal opinions.
Yes, I think that firstly now we can find out still there are some, continue of this struggle between two parties. If we look at what happened, especially the investigation proposed by a special minority in the Congress, and also at the same time, I think no matter what will happen after the investigation, at least Mr. Trump's credibility and his team's maybe capability has been undermined a lot. So I think maybe there will not a way to go to impeachment on the president, but certainly I think that there will be very, very bad result for Mr. Trump and his team. Perhaps, and also it will be an opportunity for this pro-establishment for Republican to maybe control Mr. Trump and his team.
Very interesting. So this really brings us the question, if we could have all of these panelists with us talk about that. That is, what would this mean, of course, for internal politics, but also important for the US-Russia relations? At the very beginning, there seemed to be even a possibility of a honeymoon, given what Mr. Trump has been saying during the campaign. But now it seems that everything going back to the original track, probably even more. Professor Fedyashin, did I have the right feeling?
You do have the right feeling, but let me put it this way. There are several very important details here that will affect the relationship going forward. First of all, I think it was very sort of naive in a good way, I guess, to expect a flourishing sort of honeymoon with Trump coming to power. Some people in Moscow believe this, but no one terribly serious that I've heard. But there was a lot of that feeling. There was some of that feeling here in the United States, although significantly less. The problem with pinning all your hopes for a honeymoon on the president alone is that it completely ignores the rest of the U.S. government and the feeling on Capitol Hill. There are a lot of moving parts here in Washington. There's a lot of opposition to this kind of rapprochement. So to have believed that this would have happened to begin with was really to be overly optimistic. But then there's another side to this story, which is also very interesting. Nixon, of course, came up a second ago. There are very interesting parallels to the way that the Trump White House runs its foreign policy to the way that the Nixon administration did, which was to run it directly out of the White House. And this is how the Trump administration has been doing this. If you've noticed, I'm not sure if CGTN has reported, but the daily State Department briefings have come to an end. Before, during the Obama administration, Admiral Kirby would gather the press regularly and be in front of the camera. That's no longer the case. And Rex Tillerson, who is a very capable human being, is not in front of the cameras or making statements nearly as often as his predecessor Kerry.
Let me ask also our Russian guest about that. We don't want you to filibuster the whole discussion, Mr. Fedyashin, but Mr. Babich, at this point, what do you think is the right strategy for Moscow? Do you want to just stay aside, let them fight, to do as little as possible, or do you want to come out, try to explain, or do you want to identify, quote unquote, your friends so that whoever is in Washington fighting against one another now have a better target?
You know, the official position of Moscow is not to get involved in this conflict. You summed it up right. You know, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, said that this is an internal American affair. Of course, we are sad about the fact that the mere contact to the Russian ambassador is seen as some kind of break in the law, you know, and this is, of course, very sad. I would dismiss the parallels with the Watergate scandal, because in Watergate there was a very clear-cut crime. You know, these people tried to listen illegally to record the conversations in the headquarters of the Democratic Party. Everyone saw the evidence. With the so-called hacking of the DNC mailbox, we were not presented any evidence. There was no evidence at all that it was done by Russians and not by someone else. And of course, it was immediately used politically. You know, the Washington Post in
So what I'm asking you is,
partisan.
I don't want you to do all the accusation again, because we talked about that many months ago.
Yeah, I will return to the question that you just asked.
What is the strategy for Moscow
right now?
What is the strategy for Moscow now? Do you want to stay calm?
Yes,
I will
tell you.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
The strategy, the strategy for Moscow is to fight not the personalities in the United States, but the ideology of ultra-liberal interventionism. And if we look, what's going on in the United States is not a fight between Democrats and Republicans. It's a fight between pragmatists who surround Trump and the people who want to push interventionist ideology. You see that there are some major figures in the Republican Party, the people like John McCain, the people like Lindsey Graham, who actually support the actions against Mr. Trump. So these people, formerly being Republicans, they support this liberal interventionist ideology. They want bad relations with Russia. They want more wars in the Middle East. They want confrontation with China. Let me remind you that just a few years ago, China was accused of influencing the American elections. Again, with zero evidence and with zero proof. So I think Russia and China, in this case, are interested in opposing the kind of rhetoric that we hear now from the Washington Post, from the New York Times. This rhetoric sounds McCarthyite to me.
I have to let Mr. Cui to jump in here. Every time we have an argument, Mr. Babich likes to drag China into the same line with Russia to answer that question. That's a very interesting way of doing it.
To hit the nail on the head, yes, that's my strategy.
Mr. Cui, what about your take about the other two guest answers?
I think that if we can help, we will try. But now the question, I think, firstly, is a result of
Is it an ideological divide, as Mr. Babich just mentioned, or is it just a purely political fight and want to put their own people into the White House? Or is it really about where the country is going, whether there's any corruption issue or foreign, should I say, even espionage or interaction issue with one another?
Yeah. I think that regarding to Mr. Trump and his team, we always talk about uncertainties. What does it mean for uncertainty? Which means nothing is not impossible. So I think that once there is a more investigation and more involvement of Mr. Trump's colleagues into this issue, perhaps we can find the biggest beneficiary would be some people in the Republican.
I see.
So I would like to agree with some points from our Russian guest that once something happened, bad, perhaps.
But China never influenced anybody's election.
Of course,
okay,
yes.
all right then. Let me go to Professor Fedyashin. Now, there are two things. One is whether Mr. Sessions, the Attorney General now, to what degree he will be excluded from all the investigations and things even related in minor way to that. That, in a way, will tell how much authority, Professor Fedyashin, this Attorney General will be. Will he just be a lame duck Attorney General? The second thing is whether there is going to be enough political fights to eventually find out what exactly is going on. So, Professor Fedyashin, help us to understand, with that special counsel establishment, even bipartisan, is there a possibility of really finding, quote unquote, the truth?
Well, there's always a possibility, and you know, the fact that the United States has every right to conduct any investigation that it sees fit about its election process and any involvement by any power in it is beyond doubt. This is a sovereign country. It has a long democratic tradition, and no country likes involvement in its internal political processes, be they democratic or not. The question is what's going to be found, and that, of course, no one can answer because we simply don't know. What we've been reading and hearing a lot of all over the world at this point, of course, are accusations and allegations, but no firm proof has been brought to light, and this is why there are calls for investigations. And when those investigations are done, then we can talk about what actually happened, who was involved, to what degree, if any, so on and so forth. As for the role of the Attorney General, the U.S. Justice Department will be every bit as professional in its investigation, whether Sessions is directly involved or not. There are a lot of talented people working there. A lot of this will, of course, be politicized. This is true about any country, especially with affairs of this matter. But whether he's directly involved or not, I really don't think matters terribly much. We know now that he has recused himself of investigations dealing with the election, specifically because he was part of the election campaign, not because of Russian issues, but because he was part of the election campaign.
Professor
So
Fedyashin, you said something very interesting, and it struck me because you said when the investigation is going on, the truth, to what extent will be exposed is an interesting question. The other thing is how much rhetorics and the reportings about what is going on and the images about what is going on eventually will shape the whole event and the political landscape in Washington. We all understand Mr. Trump has been attacking the so-called fake news reporting of the U.S. mainstream media. Some of the traditional American media are seriously bent on keeping their independence despite the attacks. Let's take a look at what they have been saying.
The New York Times has an editorial entitled, "What Did Trump Know and When Did He Know It?" which echoed the critical question during the Watergate scandal. What did the president know and when did he know it? And wrote, "Today the question is the same." In another editorial, the New York Times investigated the Obama administration's efforts to preserve intelligence of possible Russian interference and said it also reflected the suspicion that the Trump campaign might have colluded with Russia on election email hacks. The Huffington Post commented on the reports, saying it looks like we can still count on the Washington Post and New York Times for independent, original reporting.
Professor Fedyashin, if you could briefly tell us whether the war in the media or against the media by the Trump administration might spill over in the investigation about what exactly is going on, the Trump administration and the Russian side.
Yeah, it already has, actually. It's not a question of will it. It already has, and we see that on a daily basis here on the news, and we read it in the papers. Political rhetoric is always part of the process in Washington, D.C. That's how, capitals work all over the globe.
But you have arguments from both sides, don't
about
you?
this. It's unfortunate that. Sorry?
You have arguments from both sides, both the liberal media, as we mentioned earlier on our quotes, and also the conservative media, certainly, who is on rather the other side.
Of course. And the real problem here is that there is so little reliable information that has been discovered or released. Everything that's the firestorm going on in the United States today, especially in the mainstream media, is really a question of guessing, allegations, and accusations. So the sooner genuine and professional investigations start producing credible information, the better, because as we all know, the rumor mill becomes more active the less information there is, and vice versa.
We certainly saw that phenomenon during the election campaign when Hillary Clinton probably was facing a much bigger challenge than the current President Trump. Mr. Babich, I remember watching TV the other day, and your spokeswoman of the Kremlin was saying to the CNN reporters, you are doing fake news, when she was trying to answer the questions concerning this investigation. But from the Russian side, once again, when the accusation from Russian side like this goes stronger and stronger, is it really helping, do you think, the real investigation going on in the United States, or rather fire it up even more?
Well, first I would like to say that I agree with Mr. Fedyashin that what we heard from the Washington Post and the New York Times is mostly just rumors, accusations, allegations, and no substance. So I would not, again, I would not compare it to the Watergate scandal, when the Washington Post did a very good reporting job and they had facts against President Nixon, not just allegations. On Maria Zakharova, this is the woman that you are quoting, she is a spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she only allowed herself to criticize the attitude of the CNN television company when CNN called the Russian ambassador in the United States, Sergey Kislyak, when they called him a high-profile spy, end of quote. Well, I mean, everyone understands that every ambassador in every country is trying to, get information about the political life of that country. Every embassy in every country is monitoring elections. There is nothing criminal about it.
Okay.
So I think that Mrs. Zakharova's statement is just a reflection of the frustration that is felt in Russia about the fact that during the last at least 8 months, we had hysteria in the United States about this so-called Russian involvement in the US elections. I think everyone understands that Mr. Trump won not because of Russia, but because people in the United States were not quite happy with Hillary Clinton, with President Obama, with their foreign policy. You know, they say Mr. Trump is inexperienced in foreign policy. Well, Mr. Obama's so-called experience led him to a conflict with Russia, to a conflict with China, to several disastrous wars in the Middle East. So people in the United States are unhappy about that. There is nothing surprising about it.
I can tell you would love to have that opportunity to talk about the Obama administration and what's been done there and not done there. But before we go, Mr. Cui,
well,
yes, I know. We'll leave it for another time, Mr. Babich.
We have been talking about their preservation of intelligence, as they say.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it for another time. Mr. Cui, final words from you. We see already some of the European countries also pick up similar rhetorics with the United States, saying Russia probably is also influencing their election. So where is it going eventually? Very briefly from you.
Yes, I think certainly for these European countries, it will be a very safe way to distribute some thoughts to other countries. Because anyway, now the biggest threat for these mainstream parties in Europe is a far-right wing. So I think that it will be safe to criticize Russia or some other country to intervene these elections in this country. Yeah, it will be helpful for the mainstream parties to get a cooperation in future.